944 years ago, some local Saxons might have come to this very spot, the top of Beachy Head, and looked out there across the English Channel. And if they'd have been standing up here on the 28th of September, they'd have seen a mighty invasion fleet out there. Ships crammed with thousands of warriors and horses, and among them, Duke William of Normandy, a man who within weeks would lead that army into battle at Hastings and whose destiny it was to become King of England. 1066, the most famous date in British history. What actually happened between the Norman fleet appearing out there and the Battle of Hastings, fought 16 miles that way? Well, that's what I'll be finding out today as I walk in the footsteps of the Normans. In this series, I'll be looking at very specific moments of the Norman story, trying to find out what the great British landscape can tell us about what we know for sure and what's just speculation. And the first story I'll be looking at was played out along this stretch of the south coast. Today, I'll be armed with the most famous piece of Norman evidence of all, the Bayeux Tapestry. A detailed illustration of events that took place along my walk. It stands alongside a handful of Saxon and Norman chronicles as valuable accounts from soon after the invasion, and they mean we can be fairly certain of a few key events. William and his Norman army hit the English coastline on the 28th of September, but it was mid-October before they squared up against the might of King Harold and the Saxons. My walk is going to lead me to the battlefield itself. But why did the armies clash here, and why not earlier? On my way to battle, I want to explore the town of Hastings and understand the role of the Saxon manors that once littered the local countryside. But before that, there's the coastline itself, because first of all, the Normans needed somewhere to land. The Bayeux Tapestry gives a beautiful depiction of what William's fleet must have looked like. Absolutely vast numbers of men and horses. And you can see even the decoration on the prow of the ships here. That also leaves us in no doubt as to where William actually landed on the coast. They said they arrived in Pevensey. And that's why I've come here to Pevensey Castle to begin my journey. But the first thing you notice about this ancient coastal defensive site is that it lies a good mile from the coast. The Romans had established a fort at Pevensey some 8 centuries before the Norman invasion. At that time, the castle stood on a finger of firm ground, a projection between the marshy inlet of Pevensey Bay and the long beach that once ran beneath the castle walls. But what role did this spot play for Duke William?
Hi, David.
I've arranged to meet David Carpenter, Professor of Medieval History, and someone who can answer a very obvious question.
Well, why Pevensey? I mean, you could argue that it was just an accident, you know, the wind blew him there, but I'm absolutely sure that wasn't it. I think it was very, very carefully calculated. And Pevensey's got 2 great advantages. The first is that this Roman fort, but also if you look out there and look at all the marshland round, it's very difficult to approach, and so it's completely safe. But I don't think that was the main reason. I think it's not so much Pevensey as Pevensey Bay. Because what you've got here is that great mass of shingle beach where you can bring large numbers of ships up. You probably had well over 1,000 ships. So you can't use a port. You've got to, like 1944, D-Day, you've got to run them up onto the beach. And that's just what the Bayeux Tapestry shows, because it shows all the boats being drawn up onto the beach and then the horses being unloaded. And that's what you could do at Pevensey.
What about the Bayeux Tapestry? Because it's such an important source, and yet Historians like you are sort of questioning some of its veracity.
There's a terrific debate about it. Everyone would agree that it's early, that it's probably very soon after 1066. But beyond that, there's a great debate, because on the one hand, there's the view that it's simply the Norman story, Norman triumphalism. On the other hand, there's the view that it's got an English subtext, and that because it was certainly woven in England. And there's the idea that the English weavers, many of them women perhaps, were trying to sort of make the English case. They were trying to make Harold a great heroic figure. I mean, I personally think that's a load of nonsense.
Okay.
And that the whole of the tapestry can be explained in terms of Norman triumphalism. So, I mean, why is Harold like that? It's just that it makes the victory all the greater. And, yeah, you do have to take some of it with care, because it's very much giving the Norman version. I mean, you've got a classic example of it there, which is Harold's oath. Here he is taking this oath to Duke William, and it's basically the oath. I mean, the tapestry begins with the whole story of Edward the Confessor sending Harold to Normandy in order to take this oath to give the throne to William. Now, that's in all the Norman sources. It's not in any of the English sources at all. It's not in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is the main English source about events. And so, you know, historians have debated, did this happen or not?
I've always been fascinated by the relationship William had with England in this. I mean, he's not going to an unknown foreign land when he arrives here, is he?
The extraordinary thing about that is, which is very, very little commented on, is that Fécamp Abbey, the great ducal abbey in Normandy, where the Dukes of Normandy are buried, it has properties here, because Edward the Confessor had given Fécamp Winchelsea and Rye further up the coast. Now, that must mean there was great connections all the time, nexus between Fécamp and this area, people going backwards and forwards, bailiffs, money going backwards and forward. So the Conqueror could have been, through Fécamp, very genned up. Oh, not merely could, he was, because he spent the Easter of 1066 at Fécamp. And I'm absolutely sure that that's where he found out about the area.
So, right, he's got a sort of protected site here. He's surrounded by marshy land. Yeah. He's secured the beachhead, which is what you've got to do. What does he do next?
Well, that's another extraordinary thing, because having got to Pevensey, he leaves it immediately. I think if you look out here, look at all the marshland around, you can see why. Because Pevensey is a jolly good place to land and a jolly bad place to stay. Just basically bog all around Pevensey. And the tapestry shows this, because the tapestry shows the knights going immediately from Pevensey. And what's the actual title there? They're going to seize food. So that's one thing, but they're also going to ravage.
So, just like William and his men, I'm moving swiftly on from the isolation of Pevensey and heading east to start my walk. 10 miles along the coast is one of the ancient ports of southeast England, a commanding settlement with a history going back 2,000 years. In 1066, William chose to settle at the well-connected Saxon burh or town called Hastings. Hastings is the town that's given its name to the battle that marked one of the most important turning points in British history. That's slightly strange, because in fact the battle took place a few miles inland. But Hastings does have an important part to play in this story, because it may have been the site of William the Conqueror's first castle in England. But all that's left of that now is that mound over there. Hastings was to be the Normans' headquarters in the run-up to battle. And looking at the tapestry again, we can see a wooden fort being erected atop a patch of high ground. But the tapestry isn't precise about where this fort might have been. Today, we can only look for clues. This is the motte of Hastings Castle, a man-made defensive earth mound that the Normans like to put at the heart of all their castles and fortifications. Now, in the 1960s, it was partially excavated, and what the archaeologists discovered really surprised them, because the Normans have a great reputation as castle builders, but this motte is a bit unstable and far too sandy. It suggests that it was thrown together in quite a hurry. So it's likely, if not certain, that this humble mound was the focal point of events in early October 1066. The cliff overlooking Hastings would seem a sensible spot for William to first make his mark on English soil. And from here he unleashed a 2-week reign of terror, designed to feed his troops, devastate the area, and incite his Saxon foe into battle. So if we assume that William's army did come here to Hastings, how did he get to the battlefield, which is actually some way inland. Well, armies need good, firm ground, and there's a ridge that runs right along here towards the battlefield itself, so we can assume he went up there. However, nowadays that's all main roads, so they don't make for very interesting walking. So what I'm going to do is go slightly along the coast and then in here to find out what this landscape can tell us about these few days that had such a vast impact on English history. To get from Hastings to the battlefield, I'll walk west along the coast to find out why this town worked so well as William's headquarters. Turning inland, the extent to which this coastline has changed becomes clear as I traverse the one-time tidal inlet known as Combe Haven. All around here were the Saxon manors and settlements of the rolling Sussex countryside. In particular, I'll pass through Crowhurst, King Harold's own manor, deliberately targeted for destruction by the Normans. From here, I'll head towards the battlefield, joining the route taken by the Normans out of Hastings and through the spot where the opposing armies would have first spied each other. The final stretch of my walk follows events in the run-up to battle, leading me right onto the battlefield at Senlac Hill, beneath the Great Abbey and the town that marked the place where a new era of history was forced upon our island nation. But back at Hastings, I already know that the ancient Saxon port has been long since eradicated, lost to the sea in the area around the Hastings pier. But is it possible to imagine how Hastings might have worked for William? A question I put to the Sussex County archaeologist.
Good to meet you.
Thanks for talking to us.
Pleasure. The coastline here is completely different now, mainly because of erosion along this part of the coast. Effectively, because of the geology, you've got hard rock pieces coming out here at White Rock, at West Hill, where the castle is, and at East Hill. And between them, you've got a series of valleys. And the valleys have silted up and the headlands have eroded. So 1,000 years ago, the coastline would have been more complex than it is now.
So why choose this stretch of the south coast of England to invade?
Well, between the White Cliffs of Dover to the east and the White Cliffs at Beachy Head to the west, you've got two big areas of marshland, Pevensey Levels and the Romney Marsh, and in between those you've really got one significant area of high ground where the High Weald comes to the coast.
And is Hastings better placed then for a move inland towards the heart of Saxon England?
The High Weald is particularly good for its iron content, and the iron industry was established in the prehistoric period, but it was during the Roman period that it became very, very significant. And the Romans used a lot of the slag to create superb roads. You know, they've got metalling, slag metalling this thick, and they would have produced roads which would have lasted right through the Saxon period into the 11th century. So you've got this fantastic infrastructure of Roman roads, many of which come down to the coast around this sort of Hastings Peninsula.
So it's amazing. So we talk about William's great generalship, but so much of it actually just comes down to logistics, communications, and geography. The changing face of this coastline is absolutely key to understanding why the Normans behaved as they did. What we now see as this would once have looked more like this. And when you remember the ridge of high ground and the Roman road stretching north, Hastings starts to look like a very logical place from which to organise an operation. Today this feels like such a straight, stable piece of seafront, but in fact that's only been achieved at the expense of thousands of hours of busy human activity, building these groins out here and desperately trying to hold the beach in place and stop the channel eroding the coast as it would have done for millennia. Just west of Hastings' High Ridge, this is Bulverhythe. The name is Saxon, meaning harbour of the borough. Over 1,000 years ago, it was a narrow gateway to an inlet that filled the boggy marsh now known as Combe Haven. The question is, what state would Combe Haven have been in 1066? this is very telling. There have been 2 weeks of fine, dry weather, but even at the moment, the ground here in Coomhaven is soaking wet, completely waterlogged. Speculation has run to the idea that the Norman fleet itself could have sailed as far inland as here. But, perhaps more reliably, archaeological reports suggest humans have been digging drainage channels here since the Roman age. By the time the Normans got here, mankind was already trying to assume control. So even after all the drainage that's gone on here, all the land reclamation, it's amazing just how waterlogged Coomhaven still is. And I've never been down here before, and it's absolutely fascinating because it allows you to say with certainty that no medieval army could have passed through this march. So there's Hastings over there on that high ground. William is protected on both sides by these marshy areas. But it does also mean that he has to stick to that high ground when he moves inland. And that's why I've come down here, because you get a great view of William's route from the sea inland towards the battlefield. For 2 weeks in October 1066, the area between Hastings and the battlefield bore the brunt of the Norman army's occupation. These were productive, fertile lands, and all around Coomhaven would have been Saxon settlements, ideally placed for feeding William's troops. Well, I've emerged from the marshes, and what greets me but the sight of a cricket square. That's very Sussex. I'm sure there's a vicar on a bicycle around here somewhere. But to quote from the Domesday Book, this same area was laid waste by the Normans. 20 years after the invasion, Domesday records that 2% of Sussex lands were still entirely unproductive, all of them lying in this area around Hastings. This is the rather picturesque village of Crowhurst. We know it's been here since the Saxon period. One of the reasons is because Hurst is a classic Saxon suffix meaning clearing in the woods. But so are some of these other villages around here because they've all got ham at the end, which is another Anglo-Saxon suffix. You've got Little Worsham Farm, Pebsham Wood. Up here you've got Monkham Wood. So this is an area that's absolutely dripping in Anglo-Saxon heritage. And it's not just any old village, this one, because this was actually part of the personal estates of King Harold. Even before he seized the throne in early 1066, Harold was the most powerful landowner in this part of England, and William knew that. The would-be conqueror made a beeline for the manor of Crowhurst, inciting Harold with a direct assault on his local people. Right here next to the church is this incredible yew tree, which is at least 1,000 years old and quite possibly much older than that. And yew trees were always great meeting points for communities, and so what Christians tended to do was simply co-opt those pre-existing spiritual places and just stick a Christian site next to it. So that seems to be what's happened here. Absolutely amazing to think that this yew tree was here when William landed on that shore. Whether William himself came here or not, we'll simply never know. But we can be sure that Harold certainly wasn't at home. He was engaged in Yorkshire, crushing the Viking invasion at Stamford Bridge, leaving Crowhurst to meet its fate. Romantics would have you believe that the tapestry displays this very moment, with the harrowing image of a fleeing woman being that of Harold's mistress, Edith Swanneck, who days later would have the job of identifying the king's mutilated body. This is a fantastic historical novel published in 1948 called The Golden Warrior. One of the most dramatic scenes is when William comes here to Crowhurst, and it says that Harold's reeve had buried his lord's treasure under the great yew in the churchyard, and he and his men were taken, and not a soul would tell Duke William where the spoil was hidden. And then the reeve was hanged from the yew tree, and the rest barred within the hall and burnt. William and his captains watched the reeve die and hearkened to the cries of those burned. Some of the barons mocked, some of them yawned. The Duke kept silence, his face unchanged. Now that's pretty exciting stuff, although it has no basis in fact whatsoever. But that hasn't stopped people around here telling visitors that King Harold's reeve, his man of business, was actually hanged from a tree in this churchyard. And for me, that just shows that even nearly 1,000 years after the events of this bloody year, we're still mythologising it and still retelling the story in our own way. But by walking this land, you can go some way towards stripping away the myths and legends from the likely truth of events. As I head up the gentle slope of Telham Hill, I'm joining the route taken by the Normans as they left their camp and moved inland, attempting to grasp the upper hand as Harold completed his 250-mile journey from Yorkshire. Now, technically, I have left the footpath behind which runs along that fence, but I hope the farmer will forgive me. I'm looking for this absolutely classic view. The one view you don't get, though, is the one view I want, which is that way towards the battlefield, because the stockbroker belt's in the way. But I reckon if I get onto that road, try and peer through the hedge, I might get a better view. Now, I think this guy here has basically got the view that I want, so let's go down the hill a bit and try and cut in front of him. Also get away from his aggressive dogs. I think this might be just perfect. Wow! That's a fantastic view. There's the battlefield there, where the ruins of that abbey are now, and then as you go up the ridge you can see the windmill, which marks the site, it's said, where Harold and his army were gathering. So by the time William gets up here, he can actually see his enemy. He can almost smell them. They're so close now, they're like two juggernauts heading towards each other, two nations in arms that are bent on the destruction of the other. Chroniclers of the Norman era paint a picture of William giving a Shakespearean speech as his army eyed the opposition. The very pro-Norman William of Poitiers even has William offering Harold the chance of a noble solo combat to settle the issue of the English throne, saving the bloodshed of thousands. Harold apparently rejected the offer, saying, "Our advance continues. We march to victory." For modern visitors, the area around the battlefield now plays host to a sizable Sussex town. Well, after all that lovely tranquility, I've finally arrived at the bright lights of the town of Battle. But before I go and look at the battlefield itself, which is just there, I'm going to have a look at how the Saxons were doing at their camp over here. If the Vikings hadn't threatened in Yorkshire, Harold would have been ready and waiting in Sussex. The outcome of 1066 could have been very different. For good as William was, Harold too was a renowned commander. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that Harold mustered his troops at the Hoar Apple Tree, believed to have stood up here by the windmill on Coldbeck Hill. And that's where I'm meeting a town resident who's written about the local landscape and how it influenced events around the battle. What a fantastic view from up here.
It's gorgeous, isn't it?
Yeah. Very commanding position this. I mean, it's the first time I've been able to see a long way north. And what are the key features of that geography up there?
Well, basically trees. It's the vastness of the Andredsweald, the great Wealden forest, which covered most of Kent, Sussex and into Hampshire. It stretched north to south from here almost to the Thames, and so an impenetrable barrier really, and certainly not one that William would have relished marching through until he was certain of victory.
So how do we know that Harold chose this spot as a rendezvous?
Where we are now on Coldbeck Hill was the focal point of 300s, 100 being the local administrative unit. And there are several examples of that, some 14 at least, where apple trees were planted at those points. So really this was the first piece of open country that he could assemble troops on. And so we can be pretty sure that this is the site of the Hoar Apple Tree, of the rendezvous which the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us of.
So Harold's really sort of blocking William in here. He's trying to stop him from getting further inland and causing more damage.
That's right.
Harold acts with great speed, doesn't he? He comes down here from London. Why rush? Why not wait to gather more men, you know, garner all the resources that his kingdom had on offer to go and really crush this invader?
He enjoyed very much the element of surprising his enemies. He'd used it only a few weeks previously, most successfully up at Stamford Bridge. So
take the battle to the enemy. Don't wait for the enemy to come to you.
Well, thanks so much. So Harold was supremely confident, and William didn't want to let his troops get stuck in a British winter. Battle was inevitable. On the morning of the 14th of October, it was the Saxons who would have filed along what is now Battle High Street, a town that owes its very existence to the victory of the Normans. The Saxons headed south to this point to assume a defensive position along the top of Senlac Hill, which for me marks the end of my walk. You'd certainly be forgiven for thinking that all the fighting at the Battle of Hastings took place in this one little confined field, but that's not the case at all. It's spread a long way that way, inland, and down there to that boggy area. Up there, on that ridge, is where the English army were, rooted to the spot in a thick shield wall, beating the swords on the back of their shields, shouting, "Out, out, out." Well, down there in the valley, having made the march from the coast at Hastings, was the Norman army, archers, infantrymen, and cavalry. Accounts from the time tell us that the Battle of Hastings raged for an entire day, a remarkable duration for a set-piece medieval clash. The sides must have been fairly evenly matched, but we have little idea about how many would have fought here. Perhaps it was 5,000 per side, but it could just as easily have been 10,000 or more. There have never been any archaeological finds in this field that prove that the battle was definitely fought here. The acidic soil has done away with what the scavengers left behind. But there is one piece of evidence which is fairly conclusive. The ruins of this abbey, built by William to commemorate his victory and to do penance for the blood that was shed here and his savagery in the weeks leading up to the battle. And here at the centre of the abbey is where the high altar would have been, erected on the very spot on which King Harold was killed. Amongst the eulogising of the Norman chroniclers, the expressive licence of the Bayeux Tapestry, and a sorry lack of archaeology, the abbey stands as a rare monument in the landscape, a surviving marker for the events of the Norman invasion. Even though I've learned a huge amount about the 1066 campaign by walking the ground, there's still a huge amount that feels very obscure, like the shape of the coastline or the numbers of people involved. And I think that's because that virtually before the fighting had even stopped, people were retelling the stories and mythologising these events, and every generation since has been following suit. But one thing we can say for certain is that in 1066, in this area of the country, a decisive battle took place, one that saw Duke William of Normandy become William I, King of England, the Conqueror, and it was the beginning of the Norman Age. Join me for my next walk on the Welsh borders, when I'll be finding out what the Normans did next. They'd won a battle, but could they consolidate their rule across a whole island?